Hey guys, this is our last week in our Fear series. And honestly, our topic this week is going to be probably one of the toughest for us to work through. So far, in our weeks, we've looked at the fear of our enemies, we looked at the fear of consequences, and we looked at the fear of sharing our faith. In all those stories, we've seen God come alongside the people who were fearful, and just through his presence, he gave them confidence and boldness. My original plan for this week was to look at the fear of the unknown. Several biblical ideas came to mind as I studied. Abraham walking into the unknown, and then the warnings of Isaiah to the nation, just as far as the unknown there. And as I kept studying and praying, God just did not give me a peace about it at all. He kept bringing me back to something else. And so tonight, we're going to look at that idea that God kept in the front of my mind, and that idea is the fear of failure. Oftentimes, our desire for success is put on us by an outside source. For students, it could be oftentimes your parents, it could be teachers, or even coaches that expect you to succeed. For adults, it could be a boss, a spouse, possibly even your kids. There's also part of ourselves that wants to succeed, and we have to balance all those expectations. That leads to a lot of stress, and honestly, it could lead to a lot of fear in our lives too. Tonight, we're going to take just a few minutes and see what Scripture has to say about the fear of failure. So let's start with our fear of failing outside expectations first. I have a suspicion this is going to be the easier of the two discussions. The fear of failing other people is really just the act of people-pleasing. The fear of letting others down can control our thoughts, our actions. Proverbs 29:25 says this, that the fear of man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. Now, a snare is a kind of trap used in hunting. And a snare is a length of cable with a loop of some sort of bait in the middle, right? And when the target goes for the bait, the snare tightens around whatever part of the target's inside that loop. Our desire to please others works in much the same way. We want to make everyone happy, which is the bait that's inside the snare. And then we're blinded to the trap that comes with that desire. I know for students that grades are often a big source of fear. Do you feel like your parents or your teachers have an unrealistic expectation of your potential? I think we've all been there if we're honest at some point. We still have to make sure that we're doing our part and we're not just lowering the bar to make it easier. Adrian and I constantly have to remind our kids that we don't compare them to each other. They are three completely, totally different kids, and that comparison would just honestly be unfair. When it comes to schoolwork or anything else, we just ask them to do their absolute best. And if that ends up with a low grade or a lost game, it's okay. We don't expect them to be perfect. And often we have to remind them of that. Which brings us kind of to our second part of the discussion for tonight, our internal fear of failure. The personal side of the fear of failure is more accurately called perfectionism. Does that term ring a bell for any of you guys? Have you ever been called a perfectionist? Even if you aren't a perfectionist in personality, everyone has some area of their life where they have a tendency towards perfectionism. You might have a wreck of a room, a junk hole, but you want to make sure that your social media feed looks top notch, right? Or you might have some grades that you could do better on, or projects you need to turn in, but you have no problem spending hours each night trying to level up on that video game that's so important. I read on a blog this week that perfectionism at its core is pride. People set this excessively high standard for themselves, and then they're overly critical when those standards aren't met. Scripture tells us that we all fail to measure up. Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Nobody, regardless of how good they look on the outside, measure up to the perfection of God. But thanks to what Jesus did on the cross, that's okay. So how do we overcome both avenues of fear of failure? I have a simple answer that we're going to unpack a little bit more. That answer is that we lean on God. To overcome the fear of failure, we must first acknowledge its presence in our lives. It's hard and requires a very personal look at our motives. And then we have to figure out the source of those expectations. Are they coming from outside, or are they coming from inside of us? Are we looking to please other people with our actions, or are we striving for our own perfection? Once we get past those first two steps, we have to turn to God for the help that we need. We can't stop the fear of failure in our own power. After all, that's just right back down the path of perfectionism, right? There's a verse that I use so many times in my life when I struggle with not measuring up to my own expectation. It's found in Colossians 3:23. Let me share it with you. It says, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men." And this verse reminds me of who I'm really working for. I would love to please my parents when I was a student. I would love to make everyone happy with what I do now. But the reality is, that's not going to happen. We all fall short in some area, in some person's eyes, regardless of what we do. But when we realize that we're working for God, we can do our absolute best and then can be confident that God will make up the gap where our weakness fails. God knows our limits better than we do, and He loves us even with our shortcomings. As a matter of fact, Christ died for us while we were still sinners, failing in our own power. That truth should be comforting in itself. Our Creator doesn't expect us to be perfect. Why should we put that on ourselves? We need to do our best in everything and then trust that God will show out in our weakness. We find that promise in 2 Corinthians 12:9. It says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So guys, as we close our last week of the Fear series, we deal with perhaps the greatest fear within ourselves, the fear of failure. When that fear raises its head in our life, we need to recognize that God uses our weakness to show off His greatness. When we are faithful to do our best, God is always faithful to meet us where that takes us and see His plan to completion. That might not be an A, or it might be a lost game, but even then, when we do everything as if we're doing it for God, it will be enough. I hope you guys can internalize what the scriptures have said this week when we looked at them, and learn to adjust your thoughts when the enemy tries to chime in and tell you that you're a failure. You know what? It's not how God sees you. Don't believe the enemy's lie. Guys, I hope you have a great week. This week's session is going to be a little bit shorter, and the goal of that is for you to be able to have some time together with your leaders on a Zoom call or just in some small group discussion. I really enjoyed making these videos and being able to share with you guys. It would be so much better to be doing this in person, but right now that's not an option. So in the meantime, make sure you guys are still spending time in your Word. Make sure you're connecting with your small group leaders. And guys, I hope you have a fantastic week. We'll talk to you soon.